Chapter 4. First sight of Barbados, origin of the name, Père Labat, Bridgetown 200 years ago, slavery and Christianity, economic crisis, sugar bounties, aspect of the streets, government house and its occupants, duties of a governor of Barbados. England was covered with snow when we left it on December 30th. At sunrise on January 12th, we were anchored in the roadstead at Bridgetown, and the island of Barbados lay before us, shining in the haze of a hot summer morning. It is about the size of the Isle of Wight, cultivated so far as eye could see with the completeness of a garden. No mountains in it, scarcely even high hills, but a surface pleasantly undulating, the prevailing colour a vivid green from the cane fields. Houses in town and country white from the coral rock of which they are built, but the glare from them relieved by heavy clumps of trees. What the trees were, I had yet to discover. You could see at a glance that the island was as thickly peopled as an ant-hill. Not an inch of soil seemed to be allowed to run to waste. 200,000 is, I believe, the present number of Barbadians, of whom 9/10 are blacks. They refuse to emigrate. They cling to their home with innocent vanity as though it was the finest country in the world, and multiply at a rate so rapid that no one likes to think about it. Labour, at any rate, is abundant and cheap. In Barbados the Negro is willing enough to work, for he has no other means of living. Little land is here allowed him to grow his yams upon. Almost the whole of it is still held by the whites in large estates, cultivated by labourers on the old system, and, it is to be admitted, cultivated most admirably. If the West Indies are going to ruin, Barbados at any rate is being ruined with a smiling face. The roadstead was crowded with shipping, large barks, steamers and brigs, schooners of all shapes and sorts. The training squadron had come into the bay for a day or two on their way to Trinidad. 4 fine ships, conspicuous by their white ensigns, a squareness of yards, and generally imposing presence. Boats were flying to and fro under sail or with oars, officials coming off in white calico dress, with awnings over the stern sheets and chattering crews of Negroes. Notwithstanding these exotic symptoms, it was all thoroughly English. We were under the guns of our own men of war. The language of the Anglo-Barbadians was pure English, the voices without the smallest transatlantic intonation. On no one of our foreign possessions is the print of England's foot more strongly impressed than on Barbados. It has been ours for 2 centuries and 3/4, and was organized from the first on English traditional lines, with its constitution, its parishes, and parish churches and churchwardens, and schools and parsons, all on the old model, which the unprogressive inhabitants have been wise enough to leave undisturbed. Little is known of the island before we took possession of it, so little that the origin of the name is still uncertain. Barbados, if not a corruption of some older word, is Spanish or Portuguese, and means bearded. The local opinion is that the word refers to a banyan or fig tree which is common there, and which sends down from its branches long hairs or fibres supposed to resemble beards. I disbelieve in this derivation. Every Spaniard whom I have consulted confirms my own impression that Barbados standing alone could no more refer to trees than Barbati standing alone could refer to trees in Latin. The name is a century older than the English occupation, for I have seen it in a Spanish chart of 1525. The question is of some interest, since it perhaps implies that at the first discovery there was a race of bearded Caribs there. However this may be, Barbados, after we became masters of the island, enjoyed a period of unbroken prosperity for 200 years. Before the conquest of Jamaica, it was the principal mart of our West Indian trade, and even after that conquest, when all Europe drew its new luxury of sugar from these islands, the wealth and splendour of the English residents at Bridgetown astonished and stirred the envy of every passing visitor. Absenteeism as yet was not. The owners lived on their estates, governed the island as magistrates unpaid for their services, and equally unpaid, took on themselves the defences of the island. Père Labat, a French missionary, paid a visit to Barbados at the beginning of the 18th century. He was a clever, sarcastic kind of man, with fine literary skill, and describes what he saw with a jealous appreciation which he intended to act upon his own countrymen. The island, according to him, was running over with wealth and was very imperfectly fortified. The jewelers' and silversmiths' shops in Bridgetown were brilliant as on the Paris boulevards. The port was full of ships, the wharves and warehouses crammed with merchandise from all parts of the globe. The streets were handsome and thronged with men of business who were piling up fortunes. To the father, these sumptuous gentlemen were all most civil. The governor, an English miler, asked him to dinner and talked such excellent French that Labat forgave him his nationality. The governor, he said, resided in a fine palace. He had a well-furnished library, was dignified, courteous, intelligent, and lived in state like a prince. A review was held for the French priest's special entertainment of the Bridgetown cavalry. 500 gentlemen turned out from this one district, admirably mounted and armed. Altogether in the island, he says that there were 3,000 horse and 2,000 foot, every one of them, of course, white and English. The officers struck him particularly. He met one who had been 5 years a prisoner in the Bastille and had spent his time there in learning mathematics. The planters opened their houses to him. Dinners then as now were the received form of English hospitality. They lived well, Labat says. They had all the luxuries of the tropics, and they had imported the partridges which they were so fond of from England. They had the costliest and choicest wines, and knew how to enjoy them. They dined at 2 o'clock, and their dinner lasted 4 hours. Their mansions were superbly furnished, and gold and silver plate, he observed with an eye to business, was so abundant that the plunder of it would pay the cost of an expedition for the reduction of the island. There was another side to all this magnificence, which also might be turned to account by an enterprising enemy. There were some thousands of wretched Irish, who had been transplanted thither after the last rebellion, and were bound under articles to labour. These might be counted on to rise if an invading force appeared, and there were 60,000 slaves, who would rebel also if they saw a hope of success. They were ill-fed and hard-driven. On the least symptom of insubordination, they were killed without mercy. Sometimes they were burnt alive, or were hung up in iron cages to die. In the French and Spanish islands, care was taken of the souls of the poor creatures. They were taught their catechism, they were baptized, and attended Mass regularly. The Anglican clergy, Labat said with professional malice, neither baptized them nor taught them anything, but regarded them as mere animals. To keep Christians in slavery, they held, would be wrong and indefensible, and they therefore met the difficulty by not making their slaves into Christians. That baptism made any essential difference, however, he does not insist. By the side of Christianity, in the Catholic islands, devil worship and witchcraft went on among the same persons. No instance had ever come to his knowledge of a converted black who returned to his country who did not throw away his Christianity just as he would throw away his clothes. And as to cruelty and immorality, he admits that the English at Barbados were no worse than his own people at Martinique. In the collapse of West Indian prosperity, which followed on emancipation, Barbados escaped the misfortunes of the other islands. The black population being so dense, and the place itself being so small, the squatting system could not be tried. There was plenty of labour always, and the planters, being relieved of the charge of their workmen when they were sick or worn out, had rather gained than lost by the change. Barbados, however, was not to escape forever, and was now having its share of misfortunes. It is dangerous for any country to commit its fortunes to an exclusive occupation. Sugar was the most immediately lucrative of all the West Indian productions. Barbados is exceptionally well suited to sugar growing. It has no mountains and no forests. The soil is clean and has been carefully attended to for 250 years. It had been owned during the present century by gentlemen who for the most part lived in England on the profits of their properties, and left them to be managed by agents and attorneys. The method of management was expensive. Their own habits were expensive. Their incomes, to which they had lived up, had been cut short lately by a series of bad seasons. Money had been borrowed at high interest year after year to keep the estates and their owners going. On the top of this came the beetroot competition backed up by a bounty, and the Barbadian sugar interest, I was told, had gone over a precipice. Even the unencumbered resident proprietors could barely keep their heads above water. The returns on 3/4 of the properties on the island no longer sufficed to pay the expenses of cultivation and the interest of the loans which had been raised upon them. There was impending a general bankruptcy which might break up entirely the present system and leave the Negroes for a time without the wages which were the sole dependence. A very dark picture had thus been drawn to me of the prospects of the poor little island which had been once so brilliant. Nothing could be less like it than the bright sunny landscape which we saw from the deck of our vessel. The town, the shipping, the pretty villas, the woods, and the wide green sea of waving cane had no suggestion of ruin about them. If the ruin was coming, clearly enough it had not yet come. After breakfast, we went on shore in a boat with a white awning over it, rowed by a crew of black boatmen, large, fleshy, shining on the skin with ample feeding and shining in the face with innocent happiness. They rowed well. They were amusing. There was a fixed tariff, and they were not extortionate. The temperature seemed to rise 10 degrees when we landed. The roads were blinding white from the coral dust. The houses were white, the sun scorching. The streets were not the streets described by Labat, no splendid magazines or jewelers' shops like those in Paris or London, but there were lighters at the quays loading or unloading, carts dashing along with mule teams and making walking dangerous, signs in plenty of life and business, few white faces, but blacks and mulattoes swarming. The houses were substantial, though in want of paint. The public buildings, law courts, hall of assembly, etc., were solid and handsome, nowhere out of repair, though with something to be desired in point of smartness. The market square would have been well enough but for a statue of Lord Nelson which stands there, very like but small and insignificant, and for some extraordinary reason they have painted it a bright pea green. We crept along in the shade of trees and warehouses till we reached the principal street. Here my friends brought me to the ice house, a sort of club with reading rooms and dining rooms and sleeping accommodation for members from a distance who do not like colonial hotels. Before anything else could be thought of, I was introduced to cocktail, with which I had to make closer acquaintance afterwards. Cocktail being the established corrective of West Indian languor, without which life is impossible. It is a compound of rum, sugar, lime juice, Angostura bitters, and what else I know not, frisked into effervescence by a stick, highly agreeable to the taste and effective for its immediate purpose. Cocktail over, and walking in the heat being a thing not to be thought of, I sat for 2 hours in a balcony watching the people, who were thick as bees in swarming time. 9/10 of them were pure black. You rarely saw a white face, but still less would you see a discontented one, imperturbable good humour and self-satisfaction being written on the features of everyone. The women struck me especially. They were smartly dressed in white calico, scrupulously clean, and tricked out with ribbons and feathers, but their figures were so good, and they carried themselves so well and gracefully, that although they might make themselves absurd, they could not look vulgar. Like the old Greek and Etruscan women, they are trained from childhood to carry heavy weights on their heads. They are thus perfectly upright, and plant their feet firmly and naturally on the ground. They might serve for sculptors' models, and are well aware of it. There were no signs of poverty. Old and young seemed well fed. Some had brought in baskets of fruit, bananas, oranges, pineapples, and sticks of sugar cane. Others had yams and sweet potatoes from their bits of garden in the country. The men were active enough driving carts, wheeling barrows, or selling flying fish, which are caught off the island in shoals and are cheaper than herrings in Yarmouth. They chattered like a flock of jackdaws, but there was no quarrelling. Not a drunken man was to be seen, and all was merriment and good humour. My poor downtrodden black brothers and sisters, so far as I could judge from this first introduction, looked to me a very fortunate class of fellow creatures. Government House, where we went to luncheon, is a large, airy building shaded by heavy trees with a garden at the back of it. West Indian houses, I found afterwards, are all constructed on the same pattern, the object being to keep the sun out and let in the wind. Long verandas or galleries run round them, protected by green Venetian blinds, which can be opened or closed at pleasure. The rooms within with polished floors, little or no carpet, and contrivances of all kinds to keep the air in continual circulation. In the subdued green light, human figures lose their solidity and look as if they were creatures of air also. Sir Charles Lees and his lady were all that was polite and hospitable. They invited me to make their house my home during my stay, and more charming host and hostess it would have been impossible to find or wish for. There was not the state which Labat described, but there was the perfection of courtesy, a courtesy which must have belonged to their natures, or it would have been overstrained long since by the demands made upon it. Those who have looked on at a skating ring will have observed an orange or some such object in the centre round which the evolutions are described, the ice artist sweeping out from it in long curves to the extreme circumference, returning on interior arcs till he gains the orange again, and then off once more on a fresh departure. Barbados to the West Indian steam navigation is like the skater's orange. All mails, all passengers from Europe arrive at Barbados first. There the subsidiary steamers catch them up, bear them north or south to the Windward or Leeward Isles, and on their return bring them back to Carlisle Bay. Every vessel brings some person or persons to whom the governor is called on to show hospitality. He must give dinners to the officials and gentry of the island. He must give balls and concerts for their ladies. He must entertain the officers of the garrison. When the West Indian squadron or the training squadron drop into the roadstead, admirals, commodores, captains must all be invited. Foreign ships of war go and come continually, Americans, French, Spaniards or Portuguese, presidents of South American republics, engineers from Darien, all sorts and conditions of men who go to Europe in the English mail vessels, take their departure from Carlisle Bay, and if they are neglected, regard it as a national affront. Cataracts of champagne must flow if the British name is not to be discredited. The expense is unavoidable and is enormous, while the governor's very moderate salary is found too large by economic politicians, and there is a cry for reduction of it. I was of course most grateful for Sir Charles's invitation to myself. From him, better perhaps than from anyone, I could learn how far the passionate complaints which I had heard about the state of the islands were to be listened to as accounts of actual fact. I found, however, that I must postpone both this particular pleasure and my stay in Barbados itself till a later opportunity. My purpose had been to remain there till I had given it all the time which I could spare, thence to go on to Jamaica, and from Jamaica to return at leisure round the Antilles. But it had been ascertained that in Jamaica there was smallpox. I suppose that there generally is smallpox there, or typhus fever, or other infectious disorder. But spasms of anxiety assail periodically the souls of local authorities. Vessels coming from Jamaica had been quarantined in all the islands, and I found that if I proceeded thither as I proposed, I should be refused permission to land afterwards in any one of the other colonies. In my perplexity, my Trinidad friends invited me to accompany them at once to Port of Spain. Trinidad was the most thriving, or was at all events the least dissatisfied, of all the British possessions. I could have a glance at the Windward Islands on the way. I could afterwards return to Barbados, where Sir Charles assured me that I should still find a room waiting for me. The steamer to Trinidad sailed the same afternoon. I had to decide in haste, and I decided to go. Our luncheon over, we had time to look over the pretty gardens at Government House. There were great cabbage palms, cannonball trees, mahogany trees, almond trees, and many more, which were wholly new acquaintances. There was a grotto made by climbing plants and creepers, with a fountain playing in the middle of it, where orchids hanging on wires threw out their clusters of flowers for the moths to fertilize. Ferns waved their long fronds in the dripping showers. Hummingbirds cooled their wings in the spray and flashed in and out like rubies and emeralds. Gladly would I have lingered there, at least for a cigar, but it could not be. We had to call on the commander of the forces, Sir C. Pearson, the hero of Ekaway in the Zulu War. Him, too, I was to see again, and hear interesting stories from about our tragic enterprise in the Transvaal. For the moment, my mind was filled sufficiently with new impressions. One reads books about places, but the images which they create are always unlike the real object. All that I had seen was absolutely new and unexpected. I was glad of an opportunity to readjust the information which I had brought with me. We joined our new vessel before sunset, and we steamed away into the twilight.